Hey everyone, it's Saoirse. It's raining today, it's super cozy, so let's get started with Wild by Cheryl Strayed. This was published in 2012, and I read it a few years ago, reread it recently, so I'll read you the back. At 22, Cheryl Strayed thought she had lost everything. In the wake of her mother's death, her family scattered, and her own marriage was soon destroyed. 4 years later, with nothing more to lose, she made the most impulsive decision of her life. With no experience or training, driven only by blind will, she would hike more than 1,000 miles of the Pacific Crest Trail from the Mojave Desert through California and Oregon to Washington State, and she would do it alone. Told with suspense and style, sparkling with warmth and humor, Wild powerfully captures the terrors and pleasures of one young woman forging ahead against all odds on a journey that maddened, strengthened, and ultimately healed her. So, I have not hiked the PCT, but I thru-hiked the AT, the Appalachian Trail, in 2018, and the terrain is very different. They're on opposite sides of the country, obviously. So different physical challenges, but a lot of the psychological challenges are the same. So it was really interesting to read about a trail that I haven't done, but it's the same thing, long distance backpacking. Sort of makes me want to do the PCT, but also I'm still recovering from the AT. Yeah, the whole desert thing is that's a whole other animal that you don't get on the AT. But anyway, you will see if you read it. So it was cool to read about somebody hiking a trail before it became popular, because now the AT is wildly popular. Everybody's clogging it, and it's getting eroded in a lot of spots. It's rerouted every year to try and help with that. And I imagine the PCT is much more popular now than it used to be. So when Cheryl Strayed did it, it was in the 90s, and it was before long distance backpacking kind of blew up. So it was very cool to see how different her experience was, because she was alone so much of the time, just not seeing other hikers, which I can't imagine. I hiked alone all the time, but throughout the day and the end of the day, if you stayed at a shelter, you would see a ton of hikers on the AT. So anyway, I could just talk and talk, and then I'll run out of time again. There are a lot of things in here that stood out to me. Okay, I liked this bit here. In the beginning, she talks about how she loses her boot over the side of a mountain. The truth is, I was only half sorry to see them go. In the 6 weeks I'd spent in those boots, I'd trekked across deserts and snow, past trees and bushes and grasses and flowers of all shapes and sizes and colors, walked up and down mountains and over fields and glades and stretches of land I couldn't possibly define, except to say that I had been there, passed over it, made it through. And I liked that because that's how I felt when I was on the AT, that I was passing so many beautiful things that I couldn't name. Half the time I couldn't tell you exactly where I was, especially before I got my GPS app. It was just this sense of being there, wherever there was, in the present moment, surrounded by these particular trees. And I've never learned the names of many plants or trees, so I wasn't going and identifying everything. It was just me, my body passing through this landscape that was awe-inspiring. So I just liked how she said that. I did not lose my boots. So that just sounds like a nightmare. So if you've read this book, it's kind of starts off talking about how Cheryl Strayed's mother passed away, and so now I've read it twice, and both times immediately just ugly crying. The way that she writes about it is so heartbreaking, because she was in her early 20s when her mother died. So while she's dying, Cheryl asks, "Have I been the best daughter in the world?" She said, "Yes, I had, of course, but this was not enough. I wanted those words to knit together in my mother's mind, and for them to be delivered fresh to me. I was ravenous for love." So that idea of desperately trying to be loved in the way that we want to be loved, and we can't ever force anything from anyone, especially emotion or words. You can't get somebody to say a particular thing and then believe that they came up with it themselves, but we do try, don't we? And yeah, just that whole part just wrecks me, and it's throughout the book that she's coming to terms still with her mother's death, and it's painful. Beautiful, beautifully written. And I said in my last video that I was supposed to go to a workshop thing with Cheryl Strayed in North Carolina recently, and due to horrible unforeseen circumstances couldn't make it, but I'm hoping one day I'll get to do that because I really, really admire her. So, oh god, this part. Okay, so she starts to do heroin at a certain point in her life after her mother dies. And she says, "I think this is not me. This is not the way I am. Stop it. No more. But in the afternoons I'd return with a wad of cash to buy another bit of heroin, and I'd think, yes, I get to do this. I get to waste my life. I get to be junk." That one hurt me more than like a lot of things in here. Not because I do any drugs, but the idea of getting to waste your life, being the one who gets to decide, I get to ruin myself, and nobody can tell me not to. There's a sense of horrible freedom in that, but not the freedom that you want or that you know that you really need. Just for anybody who, for whom that idea has come into their head, it's a strange sensation. And luckily I've never fallen too far into allowing that thought to consume me, but I've definitely thought it before. I get to just wreck my life. So yeah, watching her come out of that downward spiral that she was in, but having it like always be with her, and wondering if maybe that did make her who she was in a positive way, even though she had to go through all of these horrible things, that it was important that they happened. Hi, baby. You can barely see her, but I put this stool next to me when I film now because my cats love this stool. Okay. Focusing on physical suffering. Okay, as the notion of quitting settled in, I came up with another reason to bolster my belief that this whole PCT hike had been an outlandishly stupid idea. I'd set out to hike the trail so that I could reflect upon my life, to think about everything that had broken me, and make myself whole again. But the truth was, at least so far, I was consumed only with my most immediate and physical suffering. Since I'd begun hiking, the struggles of my life had only fluttered occasionally through my mind. So that one, and then there's another line here that I want to talk about. She's talking about her pack that she carries, and it's incredibly heavy. And she says that my complicated life could be made so simple was astounding. It had begun to occur to me that perhaps it was okay that I hadn't spent my days on the trail pondering the sorrows of my life, that perhaps by being forced to focus on my physical suffering, some of my emotional suffering would fade away. By the end of that second week, I realized that since I'd begun my hike, I hadn't shed a single tear. So I was a little different. I cried like every single night on my thru-hike, and during the day and while walking. But it is so interesting the way that your brain reacts to long distance hiking, because you really think, like, I truly thought I was going to go out there and I was going to figure out my life. I was going to figure out why the things that I hated about myself existed, like what I could do to change them, how I could basically fix every single aspect of who I am. I thought I was going to dig into my trauma and think a lot about my childhood, and I did do a lot of thinking that was very upsetting, but there is just so much physical pain, and especially since she didn't have the best advice on gear, and I'm not a super ultra lighter, but definitely you wouldn't catch me carrying more than a 15-pound base weight. I would try. But yeah, she was carrying this massive pack that I can't even imagine. Like, I seriously can't imagine walking with what she had. But I have chronic neck issues and I'm always in pain, so it was really made worse by the pack and walking all day. And yeah, there was pain in every part of my body, and so I didn't have as much time to think about psychological issues, just so much physical suffering, and it really gives you a different perspective because you think about how am I going to survive until I can get to the next town to resupply on food. How am I going to make it through the next few days walking with wet socks in freezing rain? And let's just say I can't even eat Cliff Bars anymore. Can't. Yeah, so it does make you sort of heal emotionally because you realize what's important is different maybe than what you thought was important before, if that makes sense. Like, kind of almost dying all the time physically makes you emotionally different. Yeah, I liked this part. She said, I'd imagine most nights I'd lay my sleeping bag on top of my tarp and sleep beneath the stars. But about this, like so much else, I'd been wrong. Each evening I ached for the shelter of my tent, for the smallest sense that something was shielding me from the entire rest of the world, keeping me safe not from danger, but from vastness itself. I loved the dim, clammy dark of my tent, the cozy familiarity of the way I arranged my few belongings all around me each night. Can definitely relate to that, because obviously part of being on a long distance hike is that you are always exposed to the world, just completely vulnerable to everything. And it's not like you're always afraid of bears or murderers or spiders. It's not like you're always thinking about those things, but it's just sometimes everything just feels too open and you need a space to yourself, and so getting in a tent, it just makes you feel contained, like you can stop feeling like you're falling into the void, because occasionally it does feel like that. And I imagine even more so on the PCT, because the AT is very closed in, which is why they call it the green tunnel. You're in the forest a lot of the time, and on the PCT it's much more exposed. So here she's getting a ride in a car. Our top speed was perhaps 20 miles an hour as we crept around bends in the road, but it still felt to me as if we were moving unaccountably fast, the land made general rather than particular, no longer including me but standing quietly off to the side. I picked that one because when you're hitching rides, it just kind of makes everything feel cheap, because you're moving so quickly and you just spent days covering the miles that you can cover in a car very, very fast. So I knew it was a necessity. Like, you had to get rides to, sometimes towns were far off the trail and you needed food. But it was just this bizarre sense of, what is the point of everything? Like, if I can move this quickly, what, do I want to move this quickly ever again? Because I suddenly am not noticing anything, whereas I've been noticing the dew on each individual leaf that I pass, Okay, wildlife encounters. Oh god, I love this part. I woke 2 hours later with the vaguely pleasant sensation that tiny cool hands were gently patting me. They were on my bare legs and arms and face and in my hair, on my feet and throat and hands. I could feel their cool weight through my t-shirt on my chest and belly. I moaned, turning slightly before I opened my eyes, and a series of facts came to me in slow motion. There was the fact of the moon, and the fact that I was sleeping out in the open on my tarp. There was the fact that I had woken because it seemed like small, cool hands were gently patting me, and the fact that small, cool hands were gently patting me. And then there was the final fact of all, which was a fact more monumental than even the moon. The fact that those small, cool hands were not hands, but hundreds of small, cool black frogs. Small, cool, slimy black frogs jumping all over me. Each one was the approximate size of a potato chip. Now that in itself is not, like, hugely dangerous or anything, but you'd think after spending 6 months outside, I would be, like, totally cool with stuff like that. But I had a mouse in my tent once. And I don't know what it is, but it's your tent. Like, that's your safe space. You don't want anything else to get in it. And I'd heard horror stories about snakes getting into people's sleeping bags and just curling up in the bottom. I was bitten by a spider really early on and had a very infected, horrible wound that I had to get drained by a doctor at Trail Days, which is a hiker festival in Virginia. So, wildlife encounters, you know, I like to see animals at a slight distance. Saw a lot of deer. I saw a porcupine once. Never saw a moose. But anyway, the whole frog thing, I have a thing about like slimy stuff. I'm not so good with that. Let's see. Oh yeah, so she's always like out of money, and I cannot imagine the stress of her financial situation. She stops to at this place where they've got Snapple. She's obsessed with Snapple. She said, I put my hand to the glass near the bottles of lemonade. They were both yellow and pink. They were like diamonds or pornography. I could look, but I couldn't touch. And let me tell you, like, you think about food and drink all the time, especially in the summer. I was thinking so much about cold beverages, because as soon as you got your water from a stream, it would like immediately go warm in your pack. I know I'm gonna run out of time. I'd read the section in my guidebook about the trail's history the winter before, but it wasn't until now, blah blah blah, the realization of what that story meant picked up force and hit me squarely in the chest. She's saying these people who'd created the PCT had imagined people would walk, blah 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 blah. Oh yeah, that they'd be walking these mountains. They weren't imagining her. It didn't matter that everything from my cheap knockoff sandals to my high-tech by 1995 standard boots and backpack would have been foreign to them, because what mattered was utterly timeless. It was the thing that had compelled them to fight for the trail against all odds. It had nothing to do with gear or footwear or backpacking fads or philosophies of any particular era, or even getting from point A to point B. It had only to do with how it felt to be in the wild, with what it felt like to walk for miles with no reason other than to witness the accumulation of trees and meadows, mountains and deserts, streams and rocks, rivers and grasses, sunrises and sunsets. So she's saying, like, what it feels like to be a human in the wild had always felt that way and would always feel that way. She couldn't have known how profoundly the trail would both shatter and shelter her. And that got to me, because you just feel more attached to nature, connected to nature than you ever have in your life. I mean, especially if you grew up in a city like me. It's a really profound thing to feel like this kinship with people who lived maybe hundreds of years ago and obviously had it a lot harder and had to hunt and forage and all that, and you can just go into town and buy Slim Jims, but just that feeling of being alone with the trees is something very different. She's talking about how much the trail goes up and down. Going down, I realized, was like taking hold of the loose strand of yarn on a sweater you just spent hours knitting and pulling it until the entire sweater unraveled into a pile of string. Hiking the PCT was the maddening effort of knitting that sweater and unraveling it over and over again, as if everything gained was inevitably lost. And I have to say, the AT, in my opinion, just from what I've heard, is even crazier, because it's so steep in so many sections. And the PCT is graded for horses, so horses have to be able to do the inclines. Whereas the AT is like, who cares? There's no animals allowed on it other than dogs. You can't have pack animals. So there are parts where it's like hand over hand climbing, and then you go straight back down. If you want to go down, you got to go up. And it does feel absurd at times, and when you look at the elevation profile, you feel a bit like a lunatic. But it's great. So this part about her dad really gets to me too, because he was not there for her. That was my father, the man who hadn't fathered me. It amazed me every time, again and again and again. Of all the wild things, his failure to love me the way he should have had always been the wildest thing of all. But on that night, as I gazed out over the darkening land, 50-some nights out on the PCT, it occurred to me that I didn't have to be amazed by him anymore. There were so many other amazing things in this world. And that's an example of the perspective that hiking gives you. It makes your problems feel really, really small, which I think is good for everybody. Where am I? Okay. So she's crying about her mother. I had to bend over, keening while bracing my hands on my knees, my pack so heavy on top of me, my ski pole clanging out behind me in the dirt, the whole stupid life I'd had coming out my throat. It was wrong. It was so relentlessly awful that my mother had been taken from me. I couldn't even hate her properly. I didn't get to grow up and pull away from her and bitch about her with my friends and confront her about the things I wish she'd done differently, and then get older and understand that she had done the best she could and realize that what she had done was pretty damn good and take her fully back into my arms again. Her death had obliterated that. It had obliterated me. It had cut me short at the very height of my youthful arrogance. It had forced me to instantly grow up and forgive her every motherly fault at the same time that it kept me forever a child. My life both ended and begun in that premature place where we'd left off. She was my mother, but I was motherless. I was trapped by her, but utterly alone. She would always be the empty bowl that no one could fill. I'd have to fill it myself, again and again and again. She does a really good job of weaving her life into her hike. So we don't just hear about her walking, and we don't just hear about the trauma in her past, but she like really just does this amazing job of in one chapter we'll see precise examples of how like a specific event on the trail helped her cope with something specific in her past. It's just beautifully constructed. Okay, so this is a spoiler. It's the last paragraph of the book, so you can skip ahead a few seconds. It was all unknown to me then as I sat on that white bench on the day I finished my hike. Everything except the fact that I didn't have to know, that it was enough to trust that what I'd done was true, to understand its meaning without yet being able to say precisely what it was, like all those lines from the dream of a common language that had run through my days and nights and days, to believe that I didn't need to reach with my bare hands anymore, to know that seeing the fish beneath the surface of the water was enough, that it was everything. It was my life, like all lives, mysterious and irrevocable and sacred, so very close, so very present, so very belonging to me. How wild it was to let it be. I love that last line. That's beautiful. Oh my god. Somebody's getting a package delivered and they just slammed a door and that scared the crap out of me. Okay, so just some thoughts. I feel like the trail, it lives with me, but at the same time, it becomes easy after you've been away from it for a long time to forget the lessons that it taught you. And it's hard to believe that all those dark forests where I felt like I was the only person in the whole world, the only person that I could see, it's just strange that those forests could exist on the same planet as things like traffic, health insurance, student loans, social media, just things that we give so much thought to that when you're out in nature you just feel like, oh, those things don't matter. It is difficult to remind myself of those lessons when I get caught up in everyday life. And one thing I want to say about this book is people will always tell you that you hiked wrong. There are so many mean reviews about how Cheryl Strayed wasn't prepared enough. Like, why did she use gear that was too heavy? Why did she do this? Why did she run out of money? Making mistakes is not shameful, and it makes for better stories. So I made a lot of mistakes on my hike and did silly things and have some funny stories to tell from it. So don't let people tell you that you are living your adventure wrong, as long as you are not hurting other people. Hike your own hike, and yeah, that's all I have time to say because I keep running out of time in my videos, and I just really love this book. Really hope that one day I do get to see Cheryl Strayed speak in person, and yeah, highly, highly recommend. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.